All right, today I wanted to go through and discuss Cathedral by Raymond Carver, just to give you a little bit of additional insight to your own reading and the discussion boards that you have posted. So, for your discussion board, the first question was, how would you characterize the narrator's worldview, his values? We learn about our narrator's worldview very early on. The very first sentence gives us some indication on where he stands about people who are different than him. He says, "This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. His wife had died, so he was visiting the dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. He called my wife from his in laws. Arrangements were made. He would come by train, a 5 hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. She hadn't seen him since she worked for him one summer in Seattle 10 years ago, but she and the blind man had kept in touch. They made tapes and mailed them back and forth. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. He was no one I knew, and his being blind bothered me. My idea of blindness came from movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing eye dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to." In this first paragraph, we understand a lot about how our narrator is viewing Robert, the blind man. First of all, he doesn't refer to him as to Robert with his name. He just calls him the blind man, which is initially discrediting his value. He's not worth being called an actual name. From there, our narrator tells us, I don't know this guy. I'm not excited about him coming, and his blindness bothers me. He also gives us some insight onto where he learns things, which is from movies. He says his idea of blindness came from movies, and then the image he gives to us of blind people moving slowly and never laughing, being led by seeing eye dogs, are all stereotypes that our narrator has believed and is now um, making him nervous about Robert's visit. Additionally, we see here just how maybe closed-minded he is, but we also have something else being set up here, which is the relationship between Robert and his wife. It says she hadn't seen him since they worked together, but she and the blind man had kept in touch. This is important, the idea that they made tapes and mailed them back and forth. It indicates to us as readers that there is an intimacy between Robert and the wife. This is an important detail because we understand that the the narrator's wife shares a relationship with Robert that the narrator does not share with his wife. Um, then we get some background into the relationship, um, and how the wife and Robert had developed their relationship. And we get a little more insight into the wife. We learn that we're told at the end of the second paragraph, she was always trying to write a poem. She wrote a poem or two every year, usually after something really important had happened to her. This provides us some insight into the wife's character. We learn that she uses an artistic expression through the writing of poetry. And notice that it says that she writes this poetry when something important has happened. So we see that she's using words as an outlet to express herself. We also see that the narrator is a little bit concerned about something that happened between Robert and his wife. He says they'd become good friends, my wife and the blind man. On her last day at the office, the blind man asked if he could touch her face. She agreed to this. She told me he touched his fingers to every part of her face, her nose, even her neck. She never forgot it. She even tried to write a poem about it. Okay, so then we learn that she writes the poems when something important happens. So we know that this is an event that affected the wife, that it was important to her, that it's something she didn't forget. We also see that our narrator, with his inclusion of even her neck and that exclamation point, we see that the narrator is kind of incredulous about this. He's a little bit taken aback. He's a little bit unsure of, that this was appropriate for this man to be touching his wife in this way. And then we learn a little bit more about this poetry. We learn that the narrator has been told about the poems, that she showed him the poems. And it says, in the poem, she recalled his fingers and the way they had moved around her face. In the poem, she talked about what she had felt at the time, about what went through her mind when the blind man touched her nose and lips. I can remember I didn't think much of the poem. Of course, I didn't tell her that. Maybe I just don't understand poetry. I admit it's not the first thing I reach for when I pick up something to read. There's a couple of things that are important in this paragraph. First, there's this expression of the wife, and our narrator's almost what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost as though he's undermining her experience or devaluing her experience, because he's like, yeah, I didn't really think a lot about the poem. Now, he's kind enough not to tell her, but we understand that he does not have this appreciation, A, for this experience that his wife had, or for her artistic outlet. And this really is setting up who he is as a character. And we see this later on when we get to the end and how he's affected by his experience with Robert. Additionally, we see that he says this, poetry's not really what I would pick up when I was going to read, which would indicate to us that he's a reader, and yet everything else about him contradicts that notion. It doesn't really seem that he's actually a reader. In fact, he tells us that he gets his information from movies, so that is underscoring what he's saying here. Something that is important to note is that this story is being told in first person. It's our narrator giving us his experience, but it's in the retrospect. So he's looking back on this occasion. And this is important because we understand that what happened with this visit from Robert has actually affected our narrator, so much so that he had to tell somebody about it, and he's telling it in the form of this story, okay? So, then we get some information about the wife's previous marriage, um, and how things hadn't gone so well. In fact, he refers to it as her previous husband as the man who'd enjoyed her favors. Again, this isn't the nicest way, maybe, to present oneself. We learned that he was in the Air Force, and it says she called him up one night at the Air Force base in Alabama. She wanted to talk. They talked, and he's talking about Robert. She had called Robert. He asked her to send him a tape and tell him about her life. She did. She sent the tape. On the tape, she told the blind man she loved her husband, but she didn't like it where they lived, and she didn't like it that he was part of the military industrial thing. She told the blind man she had written a poem and he was in it. She told him that she was writing a poem about what it was like to be an Air Force officer's wife. The poem wasn't finished yet. She was still writing it. The blind man made a tape. He sent her the tape. She made a tape. This went on for years. My wife's officer was posted to one base and then another. She sent tapes from Moody Air Force Base, McGuire, McConnell, and finally Travis near Sacramento, where one night she got to feeling lonely and cut off from the people she kept losing in that moving around life. She got to feeling she couldn't go it another step. She went in and swallowed all the pills and capsules in the medicine chest and washed them down with a bottle of gin. Then she got into a hot bath and passed out. But instead of dying, she got sick. She threw up. Her officer, why should he have a name? He was a childhood sweetheart, and what more does he want? Came home from somewhere, found her, and called the ambulance. In time, she put it all on a tape and sent the tape to the blind man. Over the years, she put all kinds of stuff on tapes and sent the tapes off, lickety-split. Next to writing a poem every year, I think it was her chief means of recreation. On one tape, she told the blind man she decided to live away from her officer for a time. On another tape, she told him about her divorce. She and I began going out, and of course she told her blind man about it. She told him about everything, or so it seemed to me. Once she asked me if I'd like to hear the latest tape from the blind man. This was a year ago. I was on the tape, she said. So I said, okay, I'd listen to it. I got us drinks, and we settled down in the living room. We made ready to listen. First, she inserted the tape into the player and adjusted a couple of dials. Then she pushed a lever. The tape squeaked, and someone began to talk in this loud voice. She lowered the volume. After a few minutes of harmless chit-chat, I heard my own name in his mouth in the mouth of this stranger, this blind man I didn't even know. And then this, from all you've said about him, I can only conclude. But we were interrupted, a knock at the door, something, and we didn't ever get back to the tape. Maybe it was just as well. I'd heard all I wanted to. So we get some insight here as to what has happened with the wife and what is her life looked like before she met our narrator. And we know that she attempted suicide, and we know that through all of her moves, through the suicide attempt, through her divorce, through her meeting the narrator, all of this is going on tapes to Robert. And again, this is building this intimacy between the wife and Robert, of this relationship, this friendship that's very deep. Um, and we also see the narrators pushing back against knowing much about this. He gives us kind of a short summary of what happened with his wife, but then when he talks about the tapes, and he's listening to this one tape he's agreed to listen to, he's fine with the fact that they never get back to it. So it's clear here that, or starting to become clear, that Robert has a better understanding, perhaps, of the narrator's wife than the narrator has. Something else to notice here is he talks about his wife's first husband. He refers to the husband as her officer. Why should he have a name? This is an important little revelation here, because you'll notice the officer, the wife, Robert for most of the story, the narrator, all do not have names. And then once Robert's name is revealed and he's called Robert, that should give us a little bit of indication to his level of importance. All right, let's continue on. So then we get back to the idea that, well, yep, the blind man's coming and he's going to sleep over in this house. And we see the narrator say a lot of ignorant things. He's like, well, maybe I could take him bowling. And that just irritates his wife. And she's like, you can do this for me. You love me. Please do this for me. And she says, if you had a friend, any friend coming, I would make them comfortable. And he says, well, I don't have any blind friends. She's like, well, you don't really have any friends. And this gives us a little more insight. She is revealing to us that our narrator doesn't have friends. Again, there's this loneliness to him, this disconnectedness to him. And we also see it go on, well, his wife has just died. The blind man's wife has just died, Robert's wife. And we find out Robert's wife's name, Beulah. And we also learn that our narrator is not excited about her name. He's like, oh, well, she must be a woman of color, because that sounds like a name that isn't white, is basically the implication. At which point the wife responds, are you crazy? Have you just flipped or something? What's wrong with you? Are you drunk? I'm just asking, I said. He responds. Clearly we see the wife push back against this, like, what is wrong with you? You're acting crazy. You're saying crazy things. And it makes us as readers wonder, is this commonplace? And I get the impression that it is, because she follows up her, questioning of his behavior with, are you drunk? Which then is where we start to really get this inclusion of just how much our narrator is self-medicating with alcohol and weed. And that's going to continue on throughout the story, this idea of drinking. Although we did have gin and pills mentioned earlier in the story in relation to the wife. This is where we're really going to see it start taking some stock with our narrator. However, before that happens, we get some backstory on Beulah and Robert's relationship. And lots of times, students discount, or readers in general, discount this paragraph as, oh, look how ignorant our narrator is. But this paragraph's really important because it starts to provide proof to us that there has been a little bit of a shift in our narrator's mindset. That his event with Robert has, in fact, taken shape into something important. And this is how we know. It says, Beulah had gone to work for the blind man the summer after my wife had stopped working for him. Pretty soon, Beulah and the blind man had themselves a church wedding. It was a little wedding. Who'd want to go see go to such a wedding in the first place. So here he's like, who wants to see that? Just the two of them, plus the minister and the minister's wife. But it was a church wedding just the same. It was what Beulah had wanted, he had said. But even then, Beulah must have been carrying the cancer in her glands. After they had been inseparable for 8 years, my wife's word, inseparable, Beulah's health went into rapid decline. She died in a Seattle hospital room. The blind man sitting beside her, beside the bed and holding on to her hand. They had married, lived and worked together, slept together, had sex, sure, and then the blind man had to bury her. All this without having ever seen what the goddamn woman looked like. It was beyond my understanding. Hearing this, I felt sorry for the blind man for a little bit. Okay, so the first thing is that we have to remember that this story is being told after the fact. So what our narrator is choosing to reveal to us is important. He tells us here that at hearing this, I felt sorry for the blind man for a little bit. This is where we start to kind of question him, because to this point, we've not seen our narrator show any sort of empathy or sympathy for any characters, and it's hard to believe that upon hearing this, he would actually feel bad for Robert. So let's go on just a little bit. And then I found myself thinking, what a pitiful life this woman must have led. Imagine a woman who could never see herself as she was seen in the eyes of her loved one, a woman who could go on day after day and never receive the smallest compliment from her beloved, a woman whose husband could never read the expression on her face, be it misery or something better, someone who could wear makeup or not, what difference to him? She could, if she wanted, wear green eyeshadow around one eye and a straight pin in her nostril, yellow slacks and purple shoes, no matter, and then to slip off into death, the blind man's hand on her hand, his blind eyes streaming tears. I'm imagining it now. Her last thought may be this, that he never even knew what she looked like, and she on an express to the grave. Okay, this little piece here that I just read is really important because it shows that our narrator has the ability to put himself in the shoes of another. He tells us, he kind of opens this up telling us that he felt, a little bit sorry for Robert, and then he puts himself in the shoes of Beulah and how it must have felt to be her, and he's imagining this. And this is far beyond the concrete thought that we see from him otherwise. I want you to remember this paragraph because I will come back to discussing this a little bit later on. It is important to note that he bookends this paragraph by saying, Robert was left with a small insurance policy and half of a 20 peso Mexican coin. The other half of the coin went into the box with her. Pathetic. He's back. He has this moment of clarity, this moment where he's able to empathize, and then it's totally shut down with, oh, and yeah, this is pathetic. And he's not saying that their relationship is pathetic. He's saying that what Robert received through her death and having half a coin was pathetic. Okay, so let's move on from that and just continue on. So we see that a little bit later on, the wife is going to bring Robert, and the car pulls up, and our narrator is watching from inside. He says, I saw my wife laughing as she parked the car. I saw her get out of the car and shut the door. She was still wearing a smile. Just amazing. She went around to the other side of the car to where the blind man was already starting to get out. This blind man featured this. He was wearing a full beard. A beard on a blind man. Too much, I say. The blind man reached into the back seat and dragged out a suitcase. My wife took his arm, shut the car door, and, talking all the way, moved him down the drive and then up the steps to the front porch. I turned off the TV. I finished my drink, rinsed the glass, dried my hands, then I went to the door. Okay, we first see our narrator looking at this scene between his wife and Robert with amazement. And then even more so, he notices that Robert has a full beard, and this is going against the stereotype that our narrator has in his mind of what blind people should or should not be. And we're going to see Robert push back against all of these stereotypes as this goes on. My wife said, I want you to meet Robert. Robert, this is my husband. I've told you all about him. She was beaming. She had this blind man by his coat sleeve. The blind man let go of the suitcase, and up came his hand. I took it. He squeezed hard, held my hand, and then he let it go. I felt like we've already met, he boomed. Likewise, I said. I didn't know what else to say. Then I said, "Welcome. I've heard a lot about you." We began to move then, a little group. From the porch to the living room, my wife guiding him by the arm. The blind man was carrying his suitcase in the other hand. My wife said things like, "To your left here, Robert. That's right. Now watch it. There's a chair. That's it. Sit down right here. This is the sofa. We just bought this sofa 2 weeks ago." Okay, so we see here Robert saying, "Oh, I feel like I've already met you." And our narrator says likewise. We know that he is lying to Robert here because he's so uncomfortable. He doesn't know anything about blind people. He doesn't know much about Robert. And yet he's not willing to, admit that that's the case. And then we see that they have this new sofa, and our narrator says, "I started to say something about the old sofa. I like the old sofa, but I didn't say anything." This is important because it shows us our narrator's discontent maybe with the idea of change. And then he's going to engage in some small talk. "Did you have a good train ride?" I said. "Which side of the train did you sit on, by the way?" "What a question, which side?" my wife said. "What is the matter, which side?" she said. "I just asked," I said. "Right side," the blind man said. "I hadn't been on any train in nearly 40 years, not since I was a kid with my folks. That's been a long time. I'd nearly forgotten the sensation. I have winter in my beard now," he said, "so I've been told anyway." "Do I look distinguished, my dear?" the blind man said to my wife. "You look distinguished, Robert," she said. "Robert," she said, "Robert, it's just so good to see you." My wife finally took her eyes off the blind man and looked at me. I had the feeling she didn't like what she saw. I shrugged. Okay, so we have this talk here, and our narrator's asking which side, as if that actually matters. And to him it matters, but in this case, the wife calls it out. Nope, that probably doesn't matter. And then we see that he recognizes his wife is looking at him. Notice he says she finally took her eyes off the blind man. This gives us some indication that there's some jealousy happening here. And then he says, and I'm pretty sure she didn't like what she saw, but well, is basically what he says. And then we get into some observations. I've never met or personally known anyone who was blind. This blind man was late 40s, a heavy-set, balding man with stooped shoulders as if he carried a weight there. He wore brown slacks, brown shoes, a light brown shirt, a tie, and a sports coat. Spiffy. He also had this full beard, but he didn't use a cane and he didn't wear dark glasses. I'd always thought dark glasses were a must for the blind. Fact was, I wish he had a pair. At first glance, his eyes looked like anyone else's eyes, but if you look close, there was something different about them. Notice here that we're getting, again, pushing back on that stereotype with the cane and the glasses, but we also see that our narrator wishes that Robert did have the glasses, because not having the glasses makes him uncomfortable. He says, "Too much white in the iris for one thing, and the pupils seem to move around in the sockets without his knowing it or being able to stop it. Creepy." As I stared at his face, I saw the left pupil turn in toward the nose, while the other one made an effort to keep in one place. But it was only an effort, for that one eye was on the roam without his knowing it or wanting it to be. All right, so we see why he's uncomfortable here. And this is not something that is difficult to relate to, really. When you are around people who are different than you, it's very easy to feel self-conscious or to feel uncomfortable. But our narrator doesn't really know what to make of this, and he doesn't know how to make himself feel comfortable. So he decides, "Let me get you a drink. What's your pleasure? We have a little bit of everything. It's one of our pastimes." And at this point, we get the drinking to start. And he says, "Bub, I'm a Scotchman myself," he said fast enough in his big voice. "Right," I said. "Bub, sure you are. I knew it." He let his fingers touch the suitcase, which was sitting alongside the sofa. He was taking his bearings. I didn't blame him for that. "I'll move that up to your room," my wife said. "No, that's fine. It can go up when I go up." All right. So they're going to have a drink. Notice that he immediately goes to drinking to soothe his comfort. So we see that the drinking and later the weed smoking is going to act as this ability to allow, particularly our narrator, the ability to kind of open up a little bit, to calm down, to relax. Additionally, one thing I want to point out here is that Robert refers to the narrator here as Bub. Bub is not the name of the narrator. It's just like saying, "All right, bud, Bub," it's just like a little nickname type thing. It's not his actual name. So if you're writing about this essay, you are not going to refer to the narrator as Bub, because that's not his name. It's just a name that Robert is just using to be friendly. All right. So, um, they have their drinks, and then we're told a couple paragraphs later that we had another drink concerning that leg of the trip. So each leg of the trip, as he's talking, they have more drinks. And then we get another pushing back here on stereotypes. I remembered having read somewhere that the blind man didn't smoke because, as speculation had it, they couldn't see the smoke they exhaled. I thought I knew that much, and that much only about blind people. But this blind man smoked his cigarette down to the nubbin and then lit another one. This blind man filled his ashtray, and my wife emptied it. We sat down at the table for dinner. We had another drink. My wife heaped Robert's place with cube steak, scalloped potatoes, green beans. I buttered him up 2 slices of bread. I said, "Here's bread and butter for you." I swallowed some of my drink. "Now let us pray," I said, and the blind man lowered his head. My wife looked at me with her mouth agape. "Pray the phone won't ring and the food doesn't get cold," I said. We dug in. We ate everything there was to eat on the table. We ate like there was no tomorrow. We didn't talk. We ate. We scarfed. We grazed the table. We were into serious eating. The blind man had right away located his food. He knew just where everything was on his plate. I watched with admiration as he used his knife and fork on the meat. He cut 2 pieces of the meat, forked the meat into his mouth, and then go all out for the scalloped potatoes, the beans next, and then he'd tear off a hunk of butter bread and eat that. He'd follow this up with a big drink of milk. It didn't seem to bother him to use his fingers once in a while either. We finished everything, including half a strawberry pie. For a few moments we sat as if stunned. Stunned. Sweat beaded our faces. Finally, we got up from the table and left the dirty plates. We didn't look back. We took ourselves to the living room and sank into our places. Robert and my wife sat on the sofa. I took the big chair. We had us 2 or 3 more drinks while we talked about the major things that had come to pass for them in the past 10 years. Okay, so to this point, we see a couple of pushing back here on stereotypes. First, with the fact that Robert smokes, and then with the eating. We also get this moment with the narrator where he's like, "Let us pray," and we see how unusual it is for him to pray. And this is given to us first by his wife's mouth being agape. In other words, she's like holding it open, stunned, like you are when you're shocked. And then his prayer is clearly not an actual spiritual type prayer. And then we see him being really into this experience eating, but he's admiring Robert. So again, Robert is able to do something that the narrator doesn't expect. And because of that, there is an admiration of it. Once they make it back to the room, they're talking about the wife and Robert's pastimes, and we see the narrator say, "For the most part, I just listened. Now and then I joined in. I didn't want them to think I'd left the room, and I didn't want her to think I was feeling left out. They talked of things that had happened to them, these past 10 years. I waited in vain to hear my name on my wife's sweet lips, and then my dear husband came into my life, something like that, but I heard nothing of the sort. More talk of Robert. Robert had done a little of everything, it seemed, a regular blind jack of all trades, but most recently he and his wife had an Amway distributorship from which I gathered they had earned a living, such as it was. The blind man was also a ham radio operator. He talked in his loud voice about conversations he had had with fellow operators in Guam and the Philippines and Alaska and even in Tahiti. He said he'd have a lot of friends there if he ever wanted to visit those places. From time to time, he'd turn his blind face toward me, put his hand under his beard, and ask me something. How long had I been in my present position? 3 years. Did I like my work? I didn't. Was I going to stay with it? What were the options? Finally, when I thought he was beginning to run down, I got up and turned the TV on. My wife looked at me with irritation. She was heading toward a boil. Then she looked at the blind man and said, "Robert, do you have a TV?" Okay, so we learn as our narrator is sitting here listening, he's not real excited about this conversation. He's wanting to hear his wife speak of him, brag on him, and there is none of that happening. And so there's this jealousy and insecurity that's happening within this narrator. And it's important to note that our narrator, so much of him is driven by this jealousy and this insecurity. He wants to be admired by his wife, and yet his wife is putting this other attention into this other man. And it is making him jealous. But in addition to that, he's hearing the things that Robert has done. That Amway distributorship that Beulah and Robert had run. He calls him a regular blind jack of all trades. Notice there's some snark to that. We hear that Robert was a ham radio operator. And we also get a glimpse into our narrator's dissatisfaction with his own life. And that is, again, where some of this insecurity, this unhappiness is stemming. All right. So we learned that the blind man tells us that, well, my dear, I have two TVs. I have a color set and a black and white thing. An old relic. It's funny. If I turn the TV on, and I'm always turning it on, I turn on the color set. It's funny, don't you think? I didn't know what to say to that. Had absolutely nothing to say to that. No opinion. So I watched the news program and tried to listen to what the announcer was saying. Again, we have our narrator here feeling uncomfortable. He doesn't know how to feel in the situation. He doesn't know what to think of Robert. He doesn't know what to think of what Robert has to say. And so he chooses kind of not to say a whole lot. Again, he's very much an outsider here in his own home with his wife and Robert. He says, the blind man had another taste of his drink. He lifted his beard, sniffed it, and let it fall. He leaned forward to the sofa. He positioned his ashtray on the coffee table. Then he put the lighter to his cigarette. He leaned back on the sofa and crossed his legs at the ankles. My wife covered her mouth and then yawned. She stretched. She said, I think I'll go upstairs and put on my robe. I think I'll change it into something else. Robert, you make yourself comfortable. I'm comfortable. I want you to feel comfortable in this house. I am comfortable, the blind man said. Notice that our narrator is uncomfortable, and yet Robert is telling us he's completely comfortable. And by his actions, by his conversation, it appears that he is, in fact, comfortable. And this is giving us a nice juxtaposition of these two men. Robert, in a stranger's home as a blind man, is at ease and is comfortable. However, this narrator is in his own home with his wife, and because he has someone he doesn't know in his home who is different than him, he is very much uncomfortable. So that juxtaposition is important. So then the two men are left alone, and we kind of start to see a turn in the story because we no longer have the wife kind of mediating between the two or acting as a buffer. After she left the room, he and I listened to the weather report and then to the sports roundup. By that time, she'd gone so long, I didn't know she was going to come back. I thought she might have gone to bed. I wished she'd come back downstairs. I didn't want to be left alone with a blind man. I asked him if he wanted another drink, and he said sure. Then I asked if he wanted to smoke some dope with me. I said I'd just rolled a number. I hadn't, but I planned to do it in about 2 shakes. Notice here, he's lying to the blind man. It calls into this ethical question. Well, if you don't know if I'm telling the truth or not, what's the harm in lying? And there's some truth in it. I'm going to do it anyway. So this gives us some insight into the ethics of our narrator. And Robert says, I'll try some with you. Damn right, that's the stuff. I got our drinks and sat down on the sofa with him. Then I rolled us up 2 fat numbers. I lit one and passed it. I brought it to his fingers. He took it and inhaled. Hold it as long as you can, I said. I could tell he didn't know the first thing. Here we have our narrator in the position to share something he knows. So this is kind of breaking down some of this tension. My wife came back downstairs wearing her pink robe and her pink slippers. What do I smell? She said. We thought we'd have some cannabis, I said. My wife gave a savage look. Then she looked at the blind man and said, Robert, I didn't know you smoked. I do now, my dear. There's a first time for everything, but I don't feel anything yet. This stuff's pretty mellow, I said. This stuff is mild. It's dope you can reason with. It doesn't mess you up. Not much it doesn't, bub, he said and laughed. My wife sat on the sofa between the blind man and me. I passed her the number. She took it and toked and then passed it back to me. Which way is this going? She said. Then she said, I shouldn't be smoking this. I can hardly keep my eyes open as it is. That dinner did me in. I shouldn't have eaten so much. And so we're going to have them smoking, and again, we're going to see our narrator kind of in awe of Robert, that he's, like hanging on pretty good. I want to skip just a little bit of this scene because even though it's important, it is it's not providing us a whole lot of new insight, aside from the fact that it says that it was like Robert had been doing this since he was 9 years old. So even his smoking weed, even though our narrator was, quote, the teacher in this, he has the upper hand. Robert technically does it better, or does it with authority. So this gives us a little bit more insight. Okay, so same here. She said, ditto, me too. She took the roach and passed it to me. I may just sit here for a while between you two guys with my eyes closed, but don't let me bother you, okay? Either one of you. If it bothers you, say so. Otherwise, I may just sit here with my eyes closed until you're ready to go to bed. Your bed's made up, Robert, when you're ready. So we see that the wife here is basically saying, I'm going to go to sleep. I'm just going to rest here. I'm going to rest my eyes. And that's, again, opening this window for these two men to have to interact with each other without her as the buffer. Notice that she's physically a buffer between the two, sitting between them. In the next paragraph, we see that she has in fact gone to sleep. She had turned so that the robe had slipped away from her legs, exposing a juicy thigh. I reached to draw her robe back over her, and it was then that I glanced at the blind man. What the hell? I flipped the robe open again. He wants to protect his wife, but he's not threatened by Robert, which is interesting because his wife has a more intimate relationship with Robert than she does with him. And so his willingness to not be intimidated or threatened by Robert is very interesting because he's jealous of the relationship his wife has with Robert. With that said, in this particular case, it's all physically and sexually driven. What is there to be concerned about? A little while later on, as they're talking, the narrator reveals in his information to us, my wife and I hardly ever went to bed at the same time. When I did go to sleep, I had these dreams. Sometimes I'd awake from one of them, my heart going crazy. So they're sitting here watching TV, and this is where the cathedral is going to be interrupted. But we learn here that the wife and Robert are out of sync for whatever reason it seems to do with whatever it is that's bothering him, these dreams. He says every night he smoked dope and stayed up as long as he could. So he's doing what he can to, again, self-medicate. All right, so continuing on over to page 10 of this, they're watching TV, and it says, the TV showed this one cathedral. Then there was a long, slow look at another one. Finally, the picture switched to the famous one in Paris with its flying buttresses and its spires reaching up to the clouds. Going down, it says, I waited as long as I could. Then I felt I had to say something. I said, they're showing the outside of this cathedral now. Gargoyles, little statues carved in to look like monsters. Now I guess they're in Italy. Yeah, they're in Italy. They're painting on the walls of one of the churches. He's uncomfortable with the silence of the TV, and so he feels like he needs to explain to Robert. And so then, just a little bit further down, it says the camera moved to a cathedral outside Lisbon. The difference in the Portuguese cathedrals compared to the French and Italian were not that great, but they were there. Mostly the interior stuff. Then something occurred to me, and I said, something has occurred to me. Do you have any idea what a cathedral is? What they look like, that is? Do you follow me? If somebody says cathedral to you, do you have any notion what they're talking about? Do the differences between that and a Baptist church say? This is an important piece because we see, really for the first time, our narrator is inquiring, trying to better understand Robert. Even though he's uncomfortable, he's trying to figure something out. Most of us who have read the story probably would agree that this has been prompted, A, because Robert has pushed back against stereotypes, and also because of that alcohol and drug influence. Our narrator is becoming more and more mellowed. He's in his rhythm. He's watching TV at night as, you know, he's getting high. And what we hear Robert admit is that no, he doesn't actually know that much about them. He doesn't have a good understanding of cathedrals. Cathedrals, the blind man said. He sat up and rolled his head back and forth. If you want to know the truth, bub, that's about all I know. What I just said, what I heard him say. Maybe you could describe one to me? I wish you'd do it. I'd like that. If you want to know, I really don't have a good idea. And this is Robert turning it back on the narrator, because Robert is now giving the opportunity to the narrator to teach him something. So, then our narrator says, I stared some more at the cathedral before the picture flipped off into the countryside. There was no use. I turned to the blind man and said, to begin with, they're very tall. I was looking around the room for clues. They reach way up and up toward the sky. They're so big, some of them, they have to have these supports to help hold them up, so to speak. The supports are called buttresses. They remind of viaducts for some reason, but maybe you don't know viaducts either. Sometimes the cathedrals have devils and such carved into the front. Sometimes lords and ladies. Don't ask me why this is, I said. So as he is describing, he's not doing a great job. His explanation, oh, they go up and up, and they have supports and statues on them. This is not a great description of a cathedral. And he says a minute later, I'm not doing so good. I. He knows that he's struggling with this. He goes on in the next paragraph, and he's still trying to describe they're really big. So they're tall and they're big. They're massive. They're built of stone, marble too sometimes. In the olden days, when they built cathedrals, men wanted to be close to God. In the olden days, God was an important part of everyone's life. You could tell this from their cathedral buildings. I'm sorry, I said, but it looks like that's the best I can do for you. It's just no good at all. That's all right, bub, the blind man said. So Robert then, says, okay, yeah, it's okay. It's fine. I get it. But then he continues kind of probing on our narrator. Hey, listen, I hope you don't mind me asking. Can I ask you something? Let me ask you a simple question, yes or no. I'm curious, and there's no offense. You're my host, but let me ask it if you're in any way religious. You don't mind my asking. I shook my head. He couldn't see that, though. A wink is the same as a nod to a blind man. I guess I don't believe in anything. And anything. Sometimes it's hard, you know what I'm saying? Sure I do, he said. Right, I said. This piece of asking if he's religious, kind of shows us this spiritual void in our narrator. And that's not to say that one has to be religious to be spiritual, but our narrator tells us that he doesn't believe in anything, that it's hard to believe in anything, and so he just doesn't. So this is giving us some pretty strong insight into this character and this place where he is going to change. So in our last couple of pages here, he says, please forgive me. I can't do any more than that. And then the blind man sat very still, his head down, as he listened to me. I said, the truth is, cathedrals don't mean anything special to me. Nothing. Cathedrals, they're something to look at on late night TV. That's all they are. It was then that the blind man cleared his throat. He brought something up. He took a handkerchief from his back pocket. Then he said, I get it, bub. It's okay. It happens. Don't worry about it. Hey, listen to me. Will you do me a favor? I got an idea. Why don't you find us some heavy paper and a pen? We'll do something. We'll draw one together. Get us a pen and some heavy paper. Go on, bub. Get the stuff. So here's the plan Robert has. Again, keep in mind that Robert has taken on the role of the teacher here. And he says, okay, I first wanted you to describe it to me. You weren't ready to do that. So let's try a different tactic. So here's our new tactic. We're going to draw it. Now notice that ultimately it's going to be through art that the self-expression and insight that our narrator is going to have, this epiphany he has at the end, is created in part through art. And that is not by coincidence. Also, as the wife's poetry is not by coincidence. There's a lot of kind of artistic communication going on in this story and what sorts of insights it brings. Okay. So he goes and he finds what he needs. He comes back down. The blind man got down from the sofa and sat next to me on the carpet. He ran his fingers over the paper. He went up and down the sides of the paper, the edges, even the edges. He fingered the corners. All right, he said. All right, let's do her. He found my hand, the hand with the pen. He closed his hand over my hand. Go ahead, bub, draw. Draw, you'll see. I'll follow along with you. It'll be okay. Just begin now, like I'm telling you. You'll see. Draw, the blind man said. So here, again, our narrator is being encouraged by Robert, much like a coach or a teacher would encourage. So I began. First, I drew a box that looked like a house. It could have been the house I lived in. Then I put a roof on it. At either end of the roof, I drew crazy spires. Crazy. So notice he says, I drew spires. Crazy. So he's already kind of impressed with himself or amazed at what's happening. Swell, he said. Terrific. You're doing fine. Never thought anything like this could happen in your lifetime, did you, bub? Well, it's a strange life. We all know that. Go on now. Keep it up. So, two things important happen with this dialogue from Robert. First, he's, again, still encouraging. And then he tells the narrator that he's had his card all along. Never thought anything like this could happen in your lifetime, did you, bub? What? Well, it's a strange life. We all know that. Here he's basically saying, yeah, I understand what you think of me, but here I am teaching you something. And it's not a moment of superiority. It's a case of, I recognize that you're uncomfortable and we're going to find a way through this. I put in windows with arches. I drew flying buttresses. I hung great doors. I couldn't stop. The TV station went off the air. I put down the pen and closed and opened my fingers. The blind man felt around the paper. He moved the tips of his fingers over the paper, all over what I'd drawn, and he nodded. Doing fine, the blind man said. I took up the pen again, and he found my hand. I kept at it. I am no artist, but I kept drawing the same. My wife opened her eyes and gazed at us. She sat up on the sofa, her robe hanging open. She said, what are you doing? Tell me. I want to know. I didn't answer her. The blind man said, we're drawing a cathedral. Me and him are working on it. Press hard. That's right. That's good. Sure, you got it, bub. I can tell. You didn't think you could, but you can, can't you? You're cooking with gas now. You know what I'm saying? We're really going to have us something here in a minute. How's the old arm? Put some people in there now. What's a cathedral without people? So we see Robert directing him on how to do the cathedral. Put people in it. Has to have people. And he's, again, still encouraging him. And he's, again, calling out that lack of confidence. You didn't think you could do this, but look, you can. My wife said, what's going on, Robert? What are you doing? What's going on? It's all right, he said to her. Close your eyes now, the blind man said to me. I did it. I closed them, just like he said. Are they closed? He said. Don't fudge. They're closed, I said. Keep them that way, he said. He said, don't stop now. Draw. So we kept on with it. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. So we notice here he's admitting he's had an experience that is different than anything he's ever experienced to this point in his life. Then he said, I think that's it. I think you got it, he said. Take a look. What do you think? But I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do. Well, he said, are you looking? My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said. So this ending we have here is what they call a zero ending. The story just kind of ends, and we're left to kind of figure out, well, what is there? What was I supposed to take away from this? What happened here? A couple of things to note is that there is an epiphany here. When our narrator chooses to keep his eyes closed, when he says this was like nothing else he's ever experienced, when he says, I was in my house, I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything, we understand that he is having an experience that is different, that has transcended everything he thought he knew, that has kind of shattered what he believed, because he's able to say, this is something, it's really something, even though he's not actually looking at the cathedral, he's in effect become physically blind, but he has gained insight. You see, because what we've understood about Robert throughout the story is while Robert can't physically see, he can't look at things, if you will, he can see them in the sense of insight. However, our narrator, who can physically see, is emotionally blind. And so there's this juxtaposition, again, of these two men. If you go back to that idea of how the narrator's uncomfortable in his own home, whereas Robert is comfortable, this is all built through this placing of these two men side by side. And we see Robert ultimately helping our narrator have this experience to understand what someone else is feeling or what it's like for someone else. And the strong experience does this. Now, I said just a moment ago, we have a zero ending. So how do we know that this really affected any change? Earlier when I was discussing the story, I mentioned a paragraph where our narrator talks about Beulah. And I said, it's an important paragraph. And this part, and then I found myself thinking about what it must have been for her on through this paragraph. To him, she could, if she wanted, wear green eyeshadow, da 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 da, and him never seeing her. And we see here that he is able to empathize. He's able to put himself in the shoes of Beulah, what it must have been like for Beulah dying, being married to a man who could not see her. And this is our indication, this is our proof that there has been some change. Because remember, this story was told in first person retrospect. So the event with Robert happened in the past. And this right here is different than anything else that we have seen from our narrator. Elsewhere in the story, he is his closed-minded, judgmental, ignorant self. However, in this little bit of moment, and it's just a little bit of this paragraph even, we see this ability for him to think beyond himself. So we understand that something in him has changed, and it's as a result of what happened with Robert. But because, and we know this because before this experience with Robert, our narrator was incapable of caring what other people thought or what their feelings were. Remember, he didn't even want to know what was on the tapes. He didn't want to hear his wife's poetry. He wasn't really that concerned about, why it was she tried to kill herself other than she was lonely. It wasn't something they really talked about. So this insight, this empathy he's feeling for Beulah, his ability to put himself in her shoes, is really indicating something to us that's important. I think as far as all of the discussion questions go, we've done a pretty good job of kind of hitting on all of them, but I'll very quickly go over them. The second question was, how would you describe the role of alcohol and drugs in the story? They act as a social lubricant, but more so than that, they allow for this opportunity to happen. Probably without that alcohol, without those drugs, our narrator would not have been comfortable enough or open enough because, again, he was very closed off and closed-minded. The third question, Carver explores the ideas of looking versus seeing. Again, looking is, I can physically see this, but seeing is having insight. We can go beyond what's actually in front of us to see the greater importance, the emotional importance, the metaphorical importance of things. Carver's title suggests that it's significant that Robert and the narrator draw the cathedral together. Why and how is this so significant? This is important because the cathedral itself is important. A cathedral is a place of spirituality, a place where people go to gain greater insight. And so the drawing of a cathedral then helps us to understand that our narrator is, even though he's admittedly not spiritual, he's not religious, he doesn't believe in anything, that even still, this cathedral brought him greater insight. Now, it's not a push for religious insight, it's for spiritual insight, because Robert is acting as a spiritual guide through this drawing experience and through the actual description and drawing of the cathedral. So we see here that Robert is taking on a didactic role. He's teaching our narrator. That's all I have for you. If you have questions, please feel free to email me. I hope this video helps you better understand this story. I know several of you have expressed that you're going to be writing about this story, that you enjoyed the story, or that maybe you want to write about it, but there's some things you maybe didn't understand. So if you have questions, let me know.